Hello and welcome back to another episode. Today we'll be continuing with the build. From now on, most of the footage will be fast forwarded, but we will occasionally slow down to discuss some things, including, in this episode, some more advanced techniques. Currently, I'm continuing step 1 by gluing the back of the seats onto the seats. After this we start with our first, more advanced technique, moving on to multiple steps at once. While we're waiting for the glue to dry on this part of step 1, we're going to begin step 2, as this does not need parts from step 1 to do, but step 1 and 2 and 3 are needed for step 4. You see? We get these 2 or 3 steps done in unison, then we will be ready for step 4 a lot sooner. Once we've done with step 2, we will likely go back to step 1, as it should be dry by that time. Then we can alternate. This is where reading and understanding the instruction manual comes to fruition. You may be able to do many more steps at once, providing you can keep track of them and have the space. I both don't have the space or the brain capacity, so I tend to stick to 1 or 2 stages at a time at most. The standard affair here, I cut the parts out using the appropriate tools, in this case side cutters, and then trim and sand the remaining tabs, also with the appropriate tools, sanding sticks in this case. For parts A28 and A29, the air intakes of the jet, there are some very noticeable remnants of the moulding process here in the form of raised and lowered circles in the plastic. These imperfections on the finished model will be reasonably hard to see, however they include the blades of the engine. Well, as far as I'm concerned, if we can see them, then we can see these imperfections. This was an incredibly long process. This is one of the most patience demanding parts of the build so far. I started by using a flat-headed blade to chisel the bulk off. Then, as my sanding sticks were too large to fit in the gaps, used 400 grit wet and dry paper wrapped tightly around a file. For curved parts, I used a curved file that most represented the diameter of the curve. And for the flat parts, used a flat file. Once I'd done a rough pass, I raised the grit to 1500. I would have used around 800 grit for the second pass, but as I found out, I seem to not have any wet and dry between 400 and 1500. I did use the files here without wet and dry wrapped around them to start with. However, this was very coarse and was only appropriate for the initial sanding of very large protrusions. If I had files with a larger grit, this probably would have been ideal. I also occasionally dip the wet and dry paper into a small bowl of water. Wet sanding turns any dust into a paste, which is typically easier to clean, and it effectively raises the grit of the paper, meaning a smoother finish. It also makes the paper more pliable, meaning it will bend to corners or around files better. This is at the cost of longer sanding times. Whilst performing this step I did make a few mistakes, mostly when the file the wet and dry was wrapped around slipped and put a gash in the plastic. This was my own fault for rushing, and it was unfortunate, but the remedy was more sanding. All in all, the sanding took several hours. Even sped up, this will be far too long for this video. Whilst in part 1, I said this was a very good model for beginners, and I still hold that to be true. In air quotes better quality models, you would expect to not have to perform this step, as the moulding of these parts would be as it is on the real world item. In this case, smooth. But we live and learn. A large amount of dry sanding produces a large amount of dust. Wet sanding, paste. Sometimes wiping with a finger, especially a gloved finger, is enough, but you must be careful of sharp edges doing this. Sometimes, like in this case, it isn't, so I use a cotton swab dipped in water to wash away plastic, and then use the other end dry to dry the part. Then move the part around in any light to see the reflections, to determine if there is any more sanding to be done. I do this several more times before I am finished. Another big fast forward to the end of the video now. It goes without saying, as a beginner, if you wish to forego this step, I don't think you should be frustrated or feel guilty. This takes a lot of time, and when you're new to modelling, you just want to get models done and get on to the next one, and that's fine. I was certainly like that, and my instincts are to sack this kind of work off and take it as it is. But a lot of times, you just have to take a step back and think, how will this affect the finished model? You may think it's worth the extra effort, you may not, and either is completely okay. With that, this is the end of the video. I hope you'll join me for the next episode. Goodbye!